Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGameInsider.com video we have news regarding the PlayStation 4's memory architecture. Now, as many of you are aware, there's 8GB of GDDR5 memory in the system, and just how much memory has been reserved for operating functionality has been somewhat in the dark. However, now we're starting to get a better picture. It appears that the PS4 reserves a rather gargantuan amount of memory, 3.5GB of the total 8, for operating system functionality. That leaves about 4.5GB for game code. However, there is a small light at the end of the tunnel. 1GB of flexible memory can be reclaimed from operating system reservation. However, this is, and I quote, based on availability. In other words, what the operating system is currently doing. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Now, bear in mind that originally we actually thought 512 megabytes, which is a fraction, of course, of what is actually being used now, was actually going to be used by the operating system. And then we heard rumors that this wasn't actually the case. We heard further rumors that it was actually 1GB of memory being reserved for the operating system, and the rest, of course, was down to games. And that's one of the reasons that for quite a while I've been saying that, as far as I understand, 1GB is being used for operating system functionality. So what about this flexible memory? Well, from what we understand from various sources, and I'm darting around the internet right now on various forums and so on, it appears that this flexible memory is a little bit difficult to utilize. The 4.5GB is what is considered a guaranteed amount of memory. In other words, this is the minimum, pure minimum amount of memory that games developers have to work with. However, games developers can request 1GB of extra flexible memory, which obviously 1GB is quite considerable when we're only talking about 4.5 total. But there is a small caveat here. The request will only go answered if the background operating system can physically give up that memory. To put it another way, if that memory is going begging, in other words, there's nothing happening with it, it's just chilling, then by all means the game can utilize it. Contrary to that, if the memory is already being utilized, if it is being used for something else, that is not what's going to happen. The operating system say, sorry pal, no can do. This is already being used for holding X, whatever X may be. Now, many people are going to be saying, well, what in the balls happened? I mean, surely the reason for them to go to 8GB was because games developers need it. Now remember, back in the day when we all thought, including myself incidentally, that 4GB was how much memory was going to be on the PS4. In fact, originally it was supposedly going to be 2GB, and then they upped it to 4. Back then, 512 megabytes was going to be reserved for operating system functionality, which is still a fair chunk, is what it comes down to. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Sony obviously were growing more ambitious. And this is a key example of how functions such as video recording, being able to, in other words, save parts of footage and so on as you're playing the game, all of these functions come at a cost. They are not what I would consider free. Many developers, Sony themselves, say, you know what, it comes with a built-in video encoder. Microsoft say the same thing, you know, the Kinect is built in. But the reality of the matter is that somewhere, somehow, resources are being taken up to, well, hold the code to do all this stuff. So, in this case, the amount of memory has grown quite unproportionately. I mean, disproportionate isn't even the word. Now remember, the Wii U, which has 1GB of memory, available for games, 1GB is actually used for system functionality. So 2GB total and 1GB is used. So you could basically say 50% is allocated to system resources. To be honest with you, as someone who regularly plays on a PC, 8 gigs is still not exactly that great amount. I mean, it's still a reasonable chunk of memory, but when you consider that now we're actually looking for that to almost be halved, okay, if the 1 gigabyte is available, but once again, games developers, it's most likely that the first parties are going to be using this, and that's a pure, that's just me guessing on that one. It's not like I know this for certain, but the reason I'm pretty sure that the first parties are definitely going to be the ones who's using it most is because they're going to, you would assume anyway, have a clear understanding, or at least a better understanding of how to most make use of game code, or should I say the available resources for the game code. Now, many have already criticized Microsoft for the rather large, let's just go with that, resources that is allocated towards the system. We know, for example, that 10% of the GPU functionality goes towards system functions. And that's a lot, actually, when you think about it, considering that the Xbox One is already at a deficit towards the PS4 in terms of GPU, and it's not like it's just a few percent behind either. We also know that the Xbox One has considerable amount of memory towards OS functionalities. Pretty much exactly the same as the PS4. We also know that both systems now, we're almost positive the PS4 does. We know this, you guys are aware that I've done an analysis of the Killzone documents. You guys, if you're not familiar with those, you should definitely check out the videos. I've also done written documents as well on redgamingtech.com. Very interesting stuff. If you want to know more about how the PS4 works, it's a very, very good listen. So once again, I encourage you to check that out. But it gives a heavy indication that 2 of the AMD Jaguar processors are being used for, well, operating system stuff. So that's 6 cores remaining, so 6 of 8 are basically available for games, or to put it another way, 6 hardware threads, since we know that the AMD Jaguar core are not hyper-threading or whatever, they can only take 1 thread each. Now, many have already criticized, including myself, may I add, Microsoft, for the fact that the Xbox One heavily utilizes their resources to make the gameplay smoother. Now, think about it. When you're loading things such as web browsing, when you're taking, these snapshots of footage, remember, the PS4 is able to record 15 minutes of video compared to the Xbox One is 5 minutes, which is a considerable margin of difference. And some of this is obviously being stored temporarily into RAM before it can be paged out to the hard drive. It's most likely that when we're seeing all this smoothness, when we're able to see that, okay, we're able to quickly switch to a web browser or to social media applications or to whatever else, and there is no latency or lag, which is, of course, one of the big problems of the PS3. Think about the PS3 just for a moment, and I just pick on the PS3, you could easily say the Xbox as well. Certain functionalities just are not available while you're in-game. It is a black and white, it is simply not doable. You cannot browse the internet, for example, while you're in-game. Similarly, some of the other functions are just not available either. Why? Because it's a black and white answer of there is not enough available memory set aside for the operating system to do this. Memory is, once again, a commodity that is finite. And so the purpose here is that Sony and Microsoft, but let's talk about Sony because it's a Sony-centric video after all. Sony said, you know what, the purpose here is we want to be more like the Vita, and I suppose almost a little bit like even the Xbox One, although that, of course, was unintentional on their part, most likely. And they said, you know what we want to do is make the gameplay as seamless as possible. And we know this from previous interviews anyway. They said that they didn't want it to feel so disjointed as previously, where there was a massive disparity. You had to sometimes exit out of games to do something if you want to go to the store. Even things such as streaming data and playing the game while you're downloading it and various other bits and bobs, we know that this was something that Sony didn't like. They said that it A, broke the immersion of the game, B, it pissed gamers off because they were waiting to play the title. And remember, since both Sony and Microsoft are now trying to actively push the downloading content, because let's face it, for one, it stops the resale of games, and for two, it just makes things really good for them, because it means the game and these other retail stores can't bully them so much if it starts pushing it away a little bit more. And there are other benefits as well, such as reduced piracy, reduced second-hand market, and so on and so forth and so forth. So they want to really start pushing this. And as well, of course, as DLC and demos and goodness knows what else. Now, there are a few caveats here. Primarily in regards to Sony, that they have that flexible memory. That does mean that should the operating system allow it, it will be able to be available for games development. Specifically for game code to be stored and or executed by the processor at a later date. Additionally, we do know that Sony are working actively to reduce what is known as footprint. What's a footprint? Just to quickly give you an illustration, but you can by all means Google it. But all this basically means is how much of an impression it makes. You get how the footprint works there. How much of an impression it makes, how much resources it takes up from the console. A memory footprint, for example, is how much memory does this thing take up? Simple. In this case, Sony will want to reduce this as much as possible, especially as games become older and older and older. Or shall I say, the consoles become older and older and older. A quick Google, for example, shows that way back in the mists of 2010, so well before the PS4 was even really announced, or probably even really well conceived, Sony managed to wrangle 70 megabytes of additional memory for PlayStation 3 developers, which, considering there was a rather negligible amount of memory available for the PS3 and Xbox 360 for that matter, 512 megabytes, 70 megabytes from a 512, that's no laughing matter. That's a pretty decent percentage of memory. Anytime you're talking about 10%, let alone this, it's substantial and you definitely want it. So what does that mean for games? Well, for those of us who are used to PCs, we're probably going to say, well, what's going on here? I mean, how come all of this is happening? Well, one of the things you've got to remember is that a lot of games, specifically on the PC, are written in 32-bit code. This basically means that when the game is executed, it can't go above a certain amount of memory. It can't address more than 4 gigs, just for example. And so those of us with 8 gig systems, there's no sluggishness if we alt and tab or press the Windows key and do whatever we need to do and check our emails before we go back into blasting things on, Crisis or whatever. There's no real issue there. However, think about it this way. If your system is becoming somewhat sluggish in the memory department, if we realize that this isn't really the case and memory is starting to become a drag, you'll notice that your system does indeed hang for a few seconds while things are being paged and things are being sent to and from virtual memory. Once again, the amount of memory that you have, even on your PC, is finite. So if it fills up, what simply happens is your operating system says, oh gee, what the hell am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to have to put some stuff here to virtual memory, and all virtual memory is a partition, or should I say a file on your hard drive. Partition is the wrong word. A file on your hard drive. You can by all means set it inside a partition on your hard drive, but for this case it's just a file on the hard drive that temporarily stores data. And all that basically acts is a small swap file. And so, obviously, the purpose of this is so that your system doesn't run out of memory. Windows typically, by all means you can override these settings, but typically Windows will manage this swap file itself. That's one of the reasons that even if you're not saving or installing programs or whatever, if you actually take a look at your C drive or whatever partition your Windows is installed to, because obviously you may have a multi-operating system, if that makes sense, a multi-operating system computer, let's say. So 2 versions of Windows, say a Windows 8 partition and say a Windows I don't know, XP partition if you're into retro gaming, you'll notice that the host partition, so let's assume that it's the C drive, you'll notice that it grows and shrinks, and one of the reasons behind this is because of the swap file being used. Now in consoles that's not really feasible because it needs to be very snappy, and a 10 to 15 second wait isn't really what people are going to want to tolerate. I will, however, say this in no uncertain terms. As a gamer, as primarily a gamer, I would have preferred to have not seen such a large memory footprint. I would have preferred to see more memory available for games. Because, in my personal opinion, it is a fair chunk of change. I did criticize Microsoft, so it's only fair that I do the same for Sony. I think that a lot of the media functions available for the Xbox, and this is even more so for the Xbox, by the way. The Xbox One does reserve 10% of GPU power towards, well, operating system functionality. We're not really sure if the PS4 does the same thing. However, even if it does reserve the same percentage, the bottom line is because it's drawing from a much higher number, a much higher amount of power, 1.84 teraflops compared to 1.24, it's going to make less of a difference. I'm really hoping, however, that Sony can reduce this footprint for the operating system. It is pretty damn big, and I think that as textures become bigger, once again, I'd encourage you to check out the Killzone analysis videos that I've put out. I've put actually 2 out, one regarding the overall game and engine, and one regarding primarily lighting. And you can actually see just how big the textures and everything else actually become in the game. It becomes pretty startling very quickly. And that's the thing. And while I actually hate to do comparisons compared to PC and stuff, because, well, console to PC comparisons are just never really that fair. But remember, most graphics cards sold now have at least 2 GB of memory on them. We're talking about GDDR5 memory, of course. And, of course, you can either get graphics cards with 3 GB or 4 GB now. My point being that games are going to get big, and, of course, we do know that Sony are targeting the 1080p window. So I'm going to be most curious to see just how long developers are so happy with the 8 GB of memory. And see, this is another little thing that I'd like to point out as well, and this is something that both Sony and Microsoft are somewhat guilty of. It's not really a criticism, because, well, it's marketing for one, but 8 GB of GDDR5 memory is great, and they always say, well, there's 8 GB of GDDR5 memory in there, and that's great for games developers. It is, no doubt about it, but the fact of the matter is, there could be 128 GB of memory, but if only, say, 4 is available for games, for games developers to do anything with, then what does the 128 GB mean? And that's a very important distinction. And I think this is one of those things that a lot of people really need to understand. That it's not just about the specifications of a machine. It's actually about the whole package. It's about the efficiency of the operating system. It's about how many resources are available for games development. It's about the efficiency of the coding, the development kit, bug finding, and so much more besides that actually go into producing performance in a console. Anyway, this is just about it for this particular video. Hopefully there'll be more information on this in the not too distant future. I'm hoping you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. As per normal, if you want to get in touch with me directly, you can do so by going to facebook.com/redgamingtech. I'll say that one more time, facebook.com/redgamingtech, or if you want to save yourself about 200ths of a second, you can click on the links below. Once again, I'd encourage you for further information to check out the Killzone videos on this very channel, so you can just search for Killzone and a couple of bits and pieces will come up, as well as links to the relevant articles on RGT, and there's some really good breakdowns on that. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.